Greetings for the last time, score analysis students. This is Michael Hicks again, speaking to you and whoever else might want to listen. I'm sitting here late on a Saturday night, and tonight, as you can see, I'm by the fireplace. I suppose there's a few reasons for that. One, I realized that I've done one video by the water. I did the first video with an earth theme. Remember, it was at the cemetery. I did another video that was out at the roundabout in the open air, and I thought, what's left? Fire. So, earth, air, fire, water, the four great elements of old, and it seemed like a nice way to wrap things up here. I should say, too, that this interest in doing the four elements relates to my general concern with going back to sort of eternal or at least ancient verities. As I've been asked over the years, what is my philosophy of teaching? I usually say, I want people to know that there is nothing new under the sun, as Solomon said. Now, you may think that as someone who's really interested in new things, I hope that I'm known for that. Why would he say there's nothing new under the sun? Well, the things that are new are always variations. They're always embellishments of things that are always the same somehow. There are only a few things going on in the world. I think of the character in John Steinbeck's East of Eden who says, I believe that there is only one story in the world. And even though we have all these multitudes of different stories, we still come back to the same hero's journey in a sense that we all are embarking on in some way or another. So, I want to go back to the roots of this course and sort of round things off by talking about writing itself. And I'm referring here to Plato, Paul the Apostle, Richard de Fournival, and Keith Richards. Those are our four for tonight. I won't say which is earth, air, fire, and water, but let's proceed, beginning with Plato. This is from the Phaedrus, one of the great, many great dialogues of Plato. This is about 370 BC. And in this passage, as you'll hear, he's talking about writing and what it is and what it isn't. You read actually some troping on this in the Teruscan article early on, but this is the original that he is referring to in that earlier piece that you read. Okay, you have Phaedrus, the student, as usual, in a dialogue with Socrates. It's a made-up dialogue. Phaedrus is a little bit obsequious. That's pretty typical in Platonic dialogues. There's no equal relationship there. Socrates is always right. Maybe a little challenge now and then from Phaedrus in this case, but usually egging Socrates on to more knowledge and the dispensing of more wisdom. So let me start here. So this is Socrates. What's left then is aptness and ineptness in connection with writing. What feature, he asked Phaedrus, makes writing good and what inept, right? Phaedrus, yes. Socrates, well, do you know how best to please God when you either use words or discuss them in general? Not at all, do you? I can tell you what I've heard the ancients said, though they alone know the truth. However, if we could discover that ourselves, would we still care about the speculations of other people? That's a silly question still. Tell me what you, Socrates, say you've heard. Well, this is what I've heard. Among the ancient gods of Socrates in Egypt, there was one to whom the bird called the ibis is sacred. The name of that divinity was Theoth, and it was he who first discovered number and calculation, geometry and astronomy, as well as the games of drafts and dice, and above all else, writing. Now the king of all Egypt at that time was Thamus, who lived in the great city in the upper region that the Greeks call Egyptian Thebes. Thamus they called Ammon. Anyway, Theoth came to exhibit his arts to Thamus and urged him to disseminate them to all the Egyptians. Thamus asked him about the usefulness of each art, and while Theoth was explaining it, Thamus praised him for whatever he thought was right in his explanations and criticized him for whatever he thought was wrong. The story goes that Thamus said much to Theoth, both for and against each art, which it would take too long to repeat. But when they came to writing, Theoth said, "O king, here is something that once learned will make the Egyptians wiser and will improve their memory. I have discovered a potion for memory and for wisdom." Thamus, however, replied, "O most expert Theoth, one man can give birth to the elements of an art, but only another can judge how they can benefit or harm those who will use them. And now, since you are the father of writing, your affection for it has made you describe its effects as the opposite of what they really are. In fact, writing, will introduce forgetfulness into the soul of those who learn it. They will not practice using their memory because they will put their trust in writing, which is external and depends on signs that belong to others, instead of trying to remember from the inside completely on their own. You have not discovered a potion for remembering, but for reminding." I love that. "You provide your students with the appearance of wisdom, not with its reality. Your invention will enable them to hear many things without being properly taught, and they will imagine that they have come to know much, while for the most part, they will know nothing. And they will be difficult to get along with, since they will merely appear to be wise instead of really being so." And Phaedrus says to Socrates, "Socrates, you're very good at making up stories from Egypt or wherever else you want. Oh, but, my friend, the priests of the temple of Zeus at Dodona say that the first prophecies were the words of an oak. Everyone who lived at that time, not being as wise as you young ones are today, found it rewarding enough in their simplicity to listen to an oak or even a stone, so long as it was telling the truth. Well, it seems to make a difference to you, Phaedrus, who is speaking, and where he comes from. Why, though, don't you just consider whether what he says is right or wrong?" Phaedrus: "I deserved that, Socrates, and I agree that the Theban king was correct about writing." Well then, those who think they can leave written instructions for an art, as well as those who accept them, thinking that writing can yield results that are clear or certain, must be quite naive and truly ignorant of Ammon's prophetic judgment. Otherwise, how could they possibly think that words that have been written down can do more than remind those who already know what the writing is about? Quite right. You know, Phaedrus, writing shares a strange feature with painting. The offsprings of painting stand there as if they are alive, but if anyone asks them anything, they remain most solemnly silent. The same is true of written words. You'd think they were speaking as if they had some understanding, But if you question anything that has been said because you want to learn more, it continues, the writing continues to signify just that very same thing forever. When it has once been written down, every discourse rolls about everywhere, reaching indiscriminately those with understanding, no less than those who have no business with it. And it doesn't know to whom it should speak and to whom it should not. And when it is faulted and attacked unfairly, it always needs its Father's support alone. It can neither defend itself nor come to its own support. Phaedrus says, you're absolutely right about that too. Socrates, now tell me, can we discern another kind of discourse, a legitimate brother of this one? Can we say how it comes about and how it is by nature better and more capable? Phaedrus says, which one is that? How do you think it comes about? And Socrates says, it is a discourse that is written down with knowledge in the soul of the listener. It can defend itself, and it knows for whom it should speak and for whom it should remain silent. Now, this is long. I know it's a long passage, and we won't be reading anything quite this long. And this is among the readings that I've emailed to you, so you can refer to it. But this notion that writing is a memory aid, that's a deception by this God who is so drawn to it and so had so much affection for his invention. But Socrates points out that Themis instructed Theus that writing is only about reminding, and it's not the same as when you actually have something in effect written in your soul, this discourse written in the soul. We say by heart, you learn something by heart. That's so much better, and it can be deceptive if you know something only through writing, because it's only a reminder. Now, the great irony, of course, and the great maybe hypocrisy we could say of this is that we only know this of Socrates and Phaedrus and Plato because it was written down. And here it has transcended centuries and centuries of time to be here, not to remind us of something, but to instruct us. So that's the nature of writing. It's this wonderful stratum in the whole realm of communication in which we're always trying to communicate across time and across space, and to have dialogues with people who aren't there, either because they're long gone before us or because they're far distant from us. That's the nature of communication, or should I say the ambition of all communication. You should read more about this in John Durham Peters' great book, Speaking into the Air, which is a history of the idea of communication. That's the subtitle. All right, well, let's move on, because Paul the Apostle now, so this is about 60 AD. This is much later, hundreds of years later, but he's getting at some of the same things in a very different way. Now, this is in 2 Corinthians 3, and so I'll go through verses 1 through 8. Now, Paul starts this, as he often does, he gets into these interesting dialogues with his addressees in these letters, in which he's sort of defensive a little bit. He had issues with being an apostle who wasn't really from the 12. He was sort of this ad hoc apostle called directly by Jesus Christ, and not having gone through the regular channels of the church at that time. And there was a lot of debate about this, and he would challenge some of the legit, we'll say, apostles like Peter. But let's take a look at the opening here. Do we, that is he and his missionary companions, do we begin again to commend ourselves? Or need we, as some others, epistles of commendation to you or letters of commendation from you? In other words, do we need to give you letters of recommendation for our worth, or do we need to get letters of recommendation from you? He says, no, you, verse 2, are our epistle written in our hearts. You're the letter of recommendation for what we've accomplished. Known and read of all men, for as much as you are manifestly declared to be the epistle of Christ, ministered by us, written, here it is, not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not in tables of stone, but in fleshy tables of the heart. Verse 4, I don't understand. And such trust have we through Christ to Godward. Okay, number 5. Not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything as of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of God, who also hath made us able ministers of the New Testament. This new testimony from above, okay? Not of the letter, here it is, folks, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life. That's an amazing statement. He's not saying here the letter is insufficient or the letter doesn't give life, but the Spirit does. He says the letter killeth. It actually does damage. The Spirit gives life. Well, it does fatal damage. It does lethal damage. This is an extraordinarily strong statement. It's one of the most powerful statements in Scripture. It takes a lot of pondering, but I'll say something about it with respect to scores and the learning of music in just a moment. Just to finish out these last couple of verses. But if the ministration of death, that is the old law, if the ministration of death, written and engraven in stones, was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance, which glory was to be done away, how shall not the ministration of the Spirit be rather glorious? In other words, much more glorious than that. So going back here, what's the reference here? This is to Moses going Mount Sinai. He gets the commandments. They're engraven on stone. And when he comes down from the mount, he has to wear a veil over his face because he's shining so brightly. He's so filled with the glory of God from this direct contact, in effect, that he has to cover his face because it says here, the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance, which glory, he says, was to be done away. That wasn't going to last. And by the way, there are rabbinical traditions that Moses actually kept the veil on longer than he needed to because he didn't want people to see that glory fading away, which in time it necessarily did. So a great rabbinical illustration of human nature there, right? We cover it up, in this case, to shield people, to protect them from this brightness of countenance, in this case, the direct experience with God. But then it's, oh my gosh, it's fading away. I don't want people to see it fading away, so I'm going to leave the veil on a little longer than I need to. Well, that's Paul. Now, I want you to think about this with respect to musical scores and to music and the way we in our literate tradition are taught music and teach music. It is, it's written down. It's this sort of quasi-alphabetic language of scores that we've learned about and other variants of it. But there's something about this that is actually, if we take this literally, or at least take it to heart, there's actually something damaging about it. At least, I'm going to try to be, to soften this a little bit, at least we need this to learn the music. In other words, we learn things through this writing, Okay, that's the thing that was not really considered in Plato, right? That we have to get it to learn it in the first place. It's not just a process of reminding, although it was in its earliest incarnations as musical scoring, right? But once we've learned it through the writing, then we have to go beyond. It has to become internalized. It has to become written in our spirit, in our soul, in our heart. And then you really know it, and it becomes part of you, and you in some ways become knit together with it. You become part of it. So, the letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life. So at least let's say that the letter of musical scores can, if relied on too much, if we don't get to the memorization and the complete absorption in what those written figures have instructed us, it's dead. The music is dead. All right. Now, I am almost certain that none of you have read Richard de Fournival before, Master Richard's Bestiary of Love. This is from the 13th century. Now, a bestiary is not about being best. It has to do, it's a collection of beasts, okay, is what a bestiary is. And he wrote this really interesting tract to a lover who he doesn't want to forget him. And so he has done a few things here. There's this introduction that I'm going to take you through. And then through the rest of the book, he has pictures of animals. So it's like this gallery of different kinds of beasts throughout. And he writes about them, and he's trying to illustrate all the dimensions of love that exist and for which he can relate his affection for his lover. It's an interesting concept. I don't think I would try it if I were you, if you're trying to impress a lover, either present or absent. I probably wouldn't draw pictures of animals and say, this reminds me of you. But that's kind of what this is about. Now, it's the preface that I want to take you through here. This is so great. It's one of my favorite writings about writing and also about pictures. Okay. All men naturally desire knowledge. And inasmuch as no one has the capacity to know everything, although everything has the capacity to be known, it behooves everyone to know something. Then what one man does not know, another will. This sort of collective knowledge that we gain and this communal aspect of knowledge and ultimately wisdom. Thus, everything is known in such a manner that it is not known by one man for himself, but rather it is known by all in common. But all men do not coexist together. Some die, and others then are born. Our forebears knew what no one now alive could find out by his own intelligence, and it would not be known unless it were known from the ancients. So yes, it's just like we read in Plato. We can't just remember what Plato said. We have to learn it from him. How does that happen? So now this next paragraph. Wherefore God, who so loves man that he wants to provide for his every need, has given him a particular faculty of mind called memory. This memory has two doors, sight and hearing. And to each of these two doors a pathway leads, namely depiction and description. Depiction serves the eye, and description serves the ear. How one may repair to memory's house through depiction and description is evident in that memory, which guards the treasury of knowledge acquired by the mind of man by virtue of his intelligence, renders the past as if it were present. I love that. This happens by depiction and description. For when one sees the depiction of a history of Troy or of some other place, one sees the deeds of those past heroes as if they were present. So you see a painting of these things, or a cinematic depiction of them nowadays. You're seeing that as if it were happening now, as if it existed in the present. And so it is with description, he says. When one hears a romance read, one hears the adventures as if one saw them in the present. And because one is converting past to present by these two things, namely depiction and description, it is clearly apparent that by these two things one can have access to memory. And I, from whose memory you cannot depart, fair, sweetest love, without the trace of the love I had for you being ever apparent, so that I could not be completely cured of that love, with or without at least a trace of its wound. However well I might contain myself, I should like to live forever in your memory, if that could be. Wherefore I send you these two things in one, for I send you in this composition both depiction and description, so that when I am not in your presence, this composition will by its picture and its word restore me to your present remembrance. And I shall show you how this composition has depiction and description. That it describes in words is obvious, because all writing is performed to reveal the word and to be read. When it is read, the writing then reverts to word form. It is obvious, besides, that it contains depiction. That is what's going to follow here in his book. For no letter exists unless painted. Also, this composition is of such a nature as to need pictures, for animals and birds are naturally more recognizable when depicted than when described. Okay, so he's saying, I'm going to go back to this. When writing is read, the writing then reverts to word form. What that means is the things on the page are actually a kind of depiction in themselves. It's visual. You have to read aloud to get it in your ear. That's where the description part comes. That's the ear part of it. Depiction is just visual. And writing is in between the two, is straddling them, you see. It's this symbolic representation. And so he says, it's in writing. I'm sending this to you in writing, but it's performed. That is, it's read aloud, because that's, as we've talked about before, that's the history of the written word. It was meant to be read aloud. It was not meant to be read silently, or at least that was a lesser form of reading, okay? So when this is read, the writing then reverts to word form. It is obvious, besides, that it contains depiction, that is, letters, no letter exists unless painted. So you have to paint these letters to actually turn them into writing. He says, I'm also drawing you pictures at the same time. Okay, you get the concept there. Let's just relate this to, again, what we've been talking about in this course. We've talked so much about this era we're in, the post-recording era, which is to say from 1877 at the earliest onward. We learn music, most of the music in our lives, not through seeing the scores and learning from that, by hearing recordings and even seeing performances via the miracle, I'll say, of video presentation, online or whatever other form it might take. So we're into this really interesting realm of depiction of music. And so the description part is moving from the ear, that is the writing part, into the ear by being translated into music, and moving into the depiction area where the music is just played for us by someone else. We hear it, we learn it, and then we maybe go to the writing after that. Anyway, maybe it's overcomplicated there, but I think that this is a great thing to consider here about, again, the era in which we live and the ways in which we experience music and learn it. Well, this takes us to Keith Richards, of all people. This is from 2010 from his book Life. It's the first thing we read in this course. This paragraph, I'm going back to it with you now. He says, "I've learned everything I know off of records." It's all in here. Being able to replay something immediately without all that terrible stricture of written music, the prison of those bars, those 5 lines. Being able to hear recorded music freed up loads of musicians that couldn't necessarily afford to learn to read or write music, like me. Before 1900, you've got Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, Chopin, the can-can, I don't know where that came from, but with recording, it was emancipation for the people. As long as you or somebody around you could afford a machine, suddenly you could hear music made by people, not set up rigs and symphony orchestras. You could actually listen to what people were saying, almost off the cuff. Some of it can be a load of rubbish, but some of it was really good. It was the emancipation of music. Otherwise, you'd have had to go to a concert hall, and how many people could afford that? It surely can't be any coincidence that jazz and blues started to take over the world the minute recording started, within a few years, just like that. The blues is universal, which is why it's still around. Just the expression and the feel of it came in because of recording. It was like opening the audio curtains. Suddenly, it's all about depiction now, directly to the ear. Oral depiction. That's me throwing that in. He doesn't say that. And available and cheap. It's not just locked into one community here and one community there. As we get into broadcasting and the shipping, literally, of recordings, originally via parcel services and so on, but nowadays through the internet itself. And of course, that breeds another totally different kind of musician in a generation. I don't need this paper. I'm going to play it straight from the ear, straight from here, straight from the heart to the fingers. Nobody has to turn the pages. I am so grateful that you have taken this journey with me, from Keith Richards and all the way through all of this, back to this notion again, which we read in Plato and St. Paul and Richard de Fournival, and get back to what scores are about, what they tell us and what they don't tell us. And what they don't tell us is most of what music is. That's my belief. I hope that whether or not you share it, you will consider it, and somehow it will affect your music making. So this score analysis class will not just be about, rummaging through a lot of pages to determine different symbolic representations, but actually realizing that the letter can kill, but the spirit of the music gives life. Thanks again. Miss you all.